Well, hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to another session of our Continuing the Race Conversation series. I'm Suman Kapoor, CEO of Well Balanced Solutions, and I'm here with my dear friend and co-host, Tiffany Castagno, CEO of Sefer LLC. And we are super excited to have our first ever guest speaker is back with us again. We're so excited to have Dawn here. Joining us. So just a little bit of background. Actually, before I jump there, Tiffany, do we want to add anything? I feel like I'm missing something. Am I missing anything?
I think just before we introduce Dawn, who we are very grateful is alumni. She actually was our very first guest speaker, and now she's back returning. So we're very excited about that. But just as usual, we have our meetings every Friday at 12 p.m. EST. And so we're very grateful that you all join us here, whether you're new to Team Live, you're on Team Replay. We appreciate you joining us every week. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I knew I forgot something. I was just so excited to have Dawn here. I wanted to jump right in.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background about Dawn. So she's an English learner teacher in Rochester Public Schools. Previously, she was an assistant professor of teacher education with the Rochester Education Department in Rochester, Minnesota, and an assistant professor at Minnesota State University. As an assistant professor, Dawn taught literacy-based courses in which she prepared teachers for literacy instruction they will encounter in their teaching career, which included an emphasis on culturally sustaining pedagogy. Her research is focused on cultural relevant pedagogy, climate and culture of schools, and the impact of teacher self-efficacy and gender roles and stereotypes. And before becoming an assistant professor, Dawn held many positions as elementary teacher, district-wide literacy specialist, and adjunct professor. I'm just so excited you're back again. And we're so grateful that you found the time to join us. And we're excited to hear what you have in store for us in continuing the conversation around this education piece when it comes to teaching teachers and our children. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited to be back. I appreciate it. I think that, we had our first session. And so I know we had a lot of topics when we talked about continuing this because we didn't get to discuss everything the first time. And so I think we talked about how important it was to continue this conversation. And as you mentioned, culturally sustaining pedagogy is my area of research. And I think it's important, as you mentioned, that for me, the importance is how do we teach educators how to be culturally relevant teachers, and how then, because that impacts our students and our kids in the classroom. And it's so important that we have our children understanding what does it mean to be culturally literate. We don't want to see kids grow up because it may not be happening in their homes. We were talking a little bit before this about something that my daughter was told a young man that he was using his white privilege, his white male privilege. And she said, he didn't know what that was. And I said, not everyone has these conversations in their home. And so I think that it's really important that we talk about this with kids. And I think that it's scary sometimes for parents. It's scary for the teachers that we work with. And all of you who are here obviously have an open mind. You're like, why? I want to know how to do this. And that's the first step. Because as I've worked with teachers before they become teachers, so pre-service teachers, as I've worked with my colleagues, everybody's at a different spot. And I think that's the first step in recognizing that, you have to see where you are. What do I know? But the first step is being open. And so what do you know already, recognizing what you know and where you can go from there. So I think that's the first step. And then I think too, and what I'm going to try to provide today, because this is what I find that most parents or teachers want to know is, what can I actually use? What I need things to do, or how do I talk to kids? And so that's the thing. Like, I want to talk to my kids, but I don't know what I can do or how I can talk to my kids. And so I think that's really the thing that most parents or teachers want to know is, how do I actually talk to kids about race or gender or whatever the topic is that they want to talk to kids about. And I think the one thing that you really need to know is kids understand more than you think they do. And that's really the first thing that you have to understand. In fact, a teacher that I worked with in elementary, she said, that's the biggest thing that I've learned from you, is that kids really understand more than we think they do. And so they're ready. Kids are ready. I think adults are really the ones that are the most afraid. And so we'll start out, I think today, we talked last time about, at the time it was Teaching Tolerance. They've changed their name to Learning for Justice. And so they have some standards that they use and that I often start with talking about, and I'll just briefly go over those because we really focused last time on those 4 standards. And but I'll talk a little bit about those just as a review, because I don't know that we have anyone from the last time that was here. So I'll briefly touch on those. And then I want to talk a little bit about some things like intent versus impact, which we know for a lot of kids, understanding that is important. What do we mean by intent versus impact? Because kids are going to say things because they don't have a filter a lot of times. And so what do we mean by intent versus impact? The other thing I think that's really important is bias and seeing our own bias. And the other thing too that I think is really important are microaggressions. And that was something that, the reason that I want to talk about that is because when I talked with my undergrads often, I would talk about microaggressions, and I would usually have probably a half to 3/4 of my undergrad, so they made it all the way to college, and they wouldn't know what a microaggression was. And microaggressions can be very, very hurtful, because they're just like little tiny pricks, right? Can I touch your hair? Oh, where are you from? And we'll talk more about those. So those are kind of where I want to go today with this talk. And how do we talk to our kids about those? And I have some books too, because as Tiffany and I were talking last night, she knows I love children's literature. And I think children's literature is one of the best ways that you can talk to kids about race and anything when we talk about culture, being culturally relevant. So I have some books that I'll share with you today too, because those are great discussion starters with kids. So as I mentioned, Learning for Justice has these 4 areas when we talk about anti-bias. And the first is identity. So when we want to help kids think about understanding racial justice, or any area of cultural identity or justice, we want to think about identity. And that means that we have to know who we are first. Who are we as a person? Because, I thought I heard something. If we don't know who we are, then we can't understand who someone else is. And we can't understand diversity if we don't know who we are. And so we have to help each of us understand who we are as a person first. And one of the ways that I do that is, so again, I wanted to give you those pragmatic ways of doing this, is with an identity map. And so I have students do an identity map, and that's where they put their name in the middle, and then they put all the different characteristics of themselves. If I do this with older children, I try to get them to also consider ways that they have privilege. Or if I do it with adults, I have them think about their privilege also with that. So that means looking at, cisgender, white, religion, those kinds of things too. And depending on how well versed your own children are, they may recognize those. Also, so that's one of the ways that I get kids thinking about identity. Then the second is diversity. And you're going to see an education term that I use is scaffolding. If you're an educator, you're going to know it's scaffolding. These build on each other. They are scaffolded. The next then is diversity. So if you understand your own identity, then you can understand that there is diversity in the world. And so students then can understand that, oh, there is this diversity, and you have to help students then see this diversity, or children diversity. So if you're talking with your own kids, that there's diversity, right? We're not all the same. And once we have this understanding about diversity, then we can move to justice. So because there's diversity, because we're not the same, because there's these differences and privileges, there's going to be injustice, right? And what I like to do then is talk to my kids about where are ways that we see injustice in the world. How do we, find ways? How do we see this injustice, and how does that happen in the world, and where do we see it? And you can bring out, like, I find it just in the news, obviously. I mean, I'm in Minnesota, and so we have, of course, Derek Chauvin's trial happening right now. And so that's something that we're talking about quite a bit right now, as when we talk about injustice. And so looking at where do we see injustice happening around us? And then once we see injustice, this is the most important piece. And this is actually something that I'm working on some research right now. I'm actually presenting it next week at a conference, is the action piece. How do we get kids, how do we get adults to move from that recognizing that there's injustice to the action? Because if there's injustice, nothing can be done if we don't take action. So that's the fourth. The fourth is action. There won't be change if nobody takes any action. So I would say the ultimate goal for you with your own children, if you have children, or if you work with children, or if you work with adults, is how do you get them to understand that they have to be advocates and that they have to take action? And that can come in many forms, right? That could be writing letters, that can be protesting. There's lots of ways that kids can take action. That can just, and it can even be speaking out. We were just having a conversation about ways that my daughter had just done that. I personally have just been doing some stuff with the Attorney General, and then calling my senators, right? So having kids say, we can call senators, we can write letters, we can, and personally for me as an educator, if any of you are educators, I would often have, when I was doing persuasive essays in the classroom, I would have my students do that. Let's write some persuasive letters to, when we see this injustice of whatever it is, they choose their topic, write a letter to a senator or whatever. So but that's the important piece. We have to have them recognize that then there has to be this action that has to take place. So those are the Learning for Justice anti-bias standards. And those, I think, are important as we think about our children and moving them through those four pieces. Now, there's lots of moving parts then, of course, within there. If we think about how do we get them within those four anti-bias standards to where we want them to be, right? And so, of course, I think, we want our students, or our kids, I often talk about students because I do this with whatever I do with them, I do with my own children. And if we think about, I forgot, I guess I wanted to say too, when I did identity, I forgot about this one, is one way to get them thinking about with identity too, is I had a book and I forgot to show it, is also then doing name stories. And this is where students think about how they, or your kids, they can ask you and you can talk about, where did your name come from? How did you get your name? How did I decide on what I was going to name you? Sorry, I forgot to tell you this one. And one of the things that I think is really important too with names If you're an educator, obviously I'm a multilingual teacher. I'm huge on the importance of names and names being said correctly. So one of the books that I use with this is called The Name Jar. I don't know if you can see that. I know I've got a bad glare problem here. And so The Name Jar, what happens in this book is the main character comes over from Korea, and she wants to have an American name. I know, as a multilingual teacher, that breaks my heart. And so she lets a bunch of children in her class choose an American name for her and put it in the name jar. And so she goes through and she's missing her grandmother, and in the end she decides, so she keeps looking at these names and thinks, I can't pick a name. I don't know what to do. And finally at the end she realizes that the best name of all is her name. And so I love using this book with my students because it shows the importance of a name. And so when I'm talking about identity with my students, I often use this book. And so if you're talking with your own children, or if you're a teacher or an educator, this is a really good book to use with talking about the importance of identity, and also recognizing that even if you're talking about diversity, the importance of everyone's name and who they are. So this is one of my absolute favorites. So as you're teaching or talking about diversity with your own children, one of the important things to be talking about with your children, of course, is bias. Because the reality is we all have bias. It's there. And so we act on our bias, whether we think we do or we don't. We always act on our bias. It's really about how if that bias that we have can impact how we value what someone says, how much emphasis we put on the information that they give us, or if it comes from a source, how much value we put on the information that comes from that source. And so we have to introduce that to our children, because they don't know that bias exists unless we say, you have to understand that bias exists. And we have to point that out to our children. And so it impacts everything, right? So if I have a bias, it's going to impact how we see, issues like gun control, how we see issues like human rights, how we see issues like gender, how we see issues like race. And so, so we want students to be students or children to be metacognitive. And what I mean by metacognitive is that means that they think about their own thinking. They have to be able to say, wait a second, what am I thinking about this race? Why did I say that? And we had some training in our district. And if you've ever heard of Dr. Shraki Holly, one of his favorite sayings is, don't let your first thought be your last thought. And I've said that to my kids. If they say something, I'll say, wait a second, remember, don't let your first thought be your last thought. Because that first thought that immediately comes into your mind, that biased thought, you need to check it. You need to say, wait a second. Why did I think that? That's a biased thought. How can I change that thought? And if we can get kids to think that way from the beginning, then they can start to learn to check those biases, because we all have them. They're always there. And if we don't start to counter those biased thoughts, they'll always be there. And we have to teach kids to start to recognize them right away. And what can happen too then, and one activity that I like to do and I've done this with my kids, and one activity you can do with your kids to see how this happens is ask them to, and it's gotten better over the years, I will say, is to say, draw a picture of a doctor or an athlete or a scientist and see what they draw. So for example, if I say, draw a picture of a scientist, anybody have an idea of what usually gets drawn? You can put it in the chat. I feel like I'm talking to my students on distance learning. No responses. A white man. Yep.
Lab coat.
What, Mike?
Like a lab coat.
Yes. Lab coat. Yep. White guy with glasses and a lab coat. And sometimes even the hair like up like an Einstein kind of looking guy. And so you can see and you can talk to, and I like doing this with kids because you get that and you can say, let's walk around the room and look at what it looks like. And everybody has this white guy a lot of times. And as I said, it's gotten better. And sometimes you'll see a female every once in a while, but they're almost always white. And so, and it's the same thing too, if you ask them to draw, or a pilot, even a pilot, it's always a white man. And so we're talking about, see, you have this biased thought of what these look like, these professions look like. And so we want to change that. So that's a biased thought. And this is a way to do it in a way that's not so, it's non-threatening to kids. And you can do it with your own kids at home, right? Draw what you think a scientist look like. And then, well, why do you think that? Why was this the way you imagined a scientist to look, right? Well, yes, the paper is white, but if you give them crowns and things like that, they can draw it however they want. So it's a very good way to get them to be thinking about how biases come about. And I talk with that about them. This is why, we have these biased thoughts. And then the next thing that I think is important to think about and talk about with kids is then implicit bias. Because if we think about how does that come about? And really, if we think about this activity with a doctor, an athlete, and a scientist, this really does come about because of implicit bias, probably because they've seen images, like my friend who taught preschool. She threw out a bunch they had like matching cards where you had to like find the match. And of course, every single one, they were jobs, was gendered. Basically, there were, the nurse was a female, the doctor was a male, the teacher was a female, so they were very gendered. So that creates this implicit bias in kids, where it's just they internalize, right? Implicit bias means these biases that we don't recognize we're getting because we read it somewhere or we see it somewhere. And so one thing that I think is really important to do is we have to also teach our children to recognize and to think critically, to read critically, to watch the media critically, because they have to be taught to stop themselves from just internalizing the implicit biases that are out there. It's very interesting. And my children, I'm very big on this, and I'll give you an example. I thought it was funny yesterday. So my daughter checked out a book and she was super excited to read the book. It's called Prairie Lotus. It's by Linda Sue Park, who's known to be a fabulous Asian American author. And she said, I'm so excited to read this. The blurb is what's on the back of the book that tells you about it. It says that it's about a mixed race little girl, and she's not going to be allowed to go to school. And this, of course, takes place in the past because she's she's mixed race. So her dad is white and her mom is Chinese. And so back then they weren't going to let her go to school because of this. And so she said, I think it's going to be really good. And so she gets in the car yesterday and she says, Mom, I thought this book was going to be really good. And it's not. It's got lots of stereotypes. And I said, oh, really? She says, yep. It says on the front, a masterpiece. It's not a masterpiece, Mom. And I said, okay. So I said, oh, really? So tell me about it. So she says, so I have the book here. She says, yep. Lots of stereotypes about Indigenous people, Mom. And she says, I said, oh, yeah, really? She says, yeah, it says that the dad talks about it takes place, of course, near us in South Dakota. And it talks about that the Indigenous people left all the land wild and unfarmed. And we just have the right to take that land. And she said, we know that's not true. We know that the Indigenous people cultivated the land and that it wasn't wild and unfarmed. And I said, oh, yes, you're right. She goes, so that's a stereotype. They're saying that that's not. And so she says, and the dad said that it was a good thing I fed the Indigenous women because otherwise they would have harmed me. And she said, that's a stereotype that they're savage and that's not true. And she said, I don't like this book. This is perpetuating stereotypes about Indigenous people. And I said, you're right. So I've taught my kids to be critical thinkers. I've also obviously exposed them to history that's not whitewashed, so they know about these things. But that's my point. My point is we have to expose our kids to being able to think about reading critically, watching the news critically, because what's portrayed on the news, what's put in books is not always correct. And if they can't do that, then they're going to develop implicit biases. And so it's very, very important. And I think this is a skill that it's very important that you teach kids to be able to do. And my daughter's 10. I've been teaching her to do this since she was 5 or 6, to make sure that she reads critically, she thinks critically about what she's reading and doesn't just digest. Because my opinion is that implicit biases can be extremely, extremely harmful to our children. And so along with that, of course, is teaching different perspectives. And so we have to learn those different perspectives. Like my daughter saying, she understands this in these different perspectives of Indigenous people, of other races. And one way that I do that is another book, because again, I said I love books and I'm trying to provide you with books that you can use too, is a book that I use. It's called Voices in the Park. And I know this is backwards, I'm sorry. But I love to use this book, Voices in the Park, to teach different perspectives. It's absolutely fabulous. It actually even has first voice, second voice, third voice, so that, and I actually this book is actually scanned into Google so that I can have the students look at it, because they can the pictures you can actually see different things in the pictures based on the different perspectives. What I like about this book with the different perspectives is it also gets into SES with different perspectives, which I think is important. But it has great perspectives. Kids can look at the different perspectives and see, why is it important to look at different perspectives? How do we see things differently when we're someone else? And it helps create that empathy also. How do things look from different perspectives? And I think that's really important, because if we don't learn things and look at things from others' point of view, That's another reason we can't understand when we talk about different race, gender, class, anything. We can't understand another point of view if we can't see someone else's perspective. So that's something else I think that's important when we talk about bias and other things. We can't confront those if we can't see things first within ourselves and then from someone else. So I think those are, that's really something that's important. The other thing when it comes to listening or talking about perspectives is active listening, which I think is important that we have to teach when we're talking about different perspectives, when we're talking about being open to talking about race, talking about gender, talking about anything when we're talking about being culturally responsive. And we have to, I always say we have to call in and not call out. And so my big thing with my kids is we want to call in and not call out. We want to listen to what someone else has to say. And so, for example, asking someone, can you tell me more about that? So if I'm listening to someone else's perspective, can you give me more information? I'm not understanding you. I heard you say this. Can you give me an example of what you mean? Did I hear you correctly when you said this? These are really important for me when talking with my kids too, and say, you know, what did you mean by this? Especially when we're talking about other people and hearing their stories. I think that that's important, and helping our talking to our kids when we want them to help them understand. Listen, here's what you need to do when you're listening to other stories. So I think that active listening is important. If you're an educator doing this in your classroom, you know, making sure that you're encouraging this because you want it to be an open place of communication. You know, smiling is important, you know, so I think that that's important, but using that language, you know, can you tell me more? I hear you saying this. Can you explain that to me? It's again, that calling in and not calling out. I think that that's just extremely, extremely important. So I want, before I do want to, before I talk about microaggressions, I want to stop maybe. Are there any questions about anything that I've said so far?
I just have a quick question, Dawn, on, you mentioned SES. Can you just share with us what that is?
Oh, social economic status?
Okay, I've never heard it that way before.
Oh.
Okay, well, there you go.
I feel like I'm throwing out a lot of information, but I have a lot to say, and I'm like, ah.
Dawn, I just have a quick question. I guess I just made the comment in the comments, but
I know, I'm sorry, I'm talking, and so I can't see all the comments.
No, I wanted to bring it up because I just had a very kind of frustrating conversation with some people a few days ago, and it was they were upset with their teacher because the teacher took some time in the class to explain the Stop Asian Hate, and then she's of Asian background, and then she went into talk about all the different cultures that fall under AAPI and how culturally, you know, even communication wise, not from a language perspective, but just culturally, right? Like, you know, certain cultures don't speak up. Some are more, you know, used to speaking up, right? And how that can change dynamics and all this other stuff. And, you know, listening to it was a very normal conversation, but it upset the parents. And so how do you balance having these kind of woke conversations with kids when some of the parents aren't there and aren't receptive and will push back, and maybe they're teaching something different in their households?
So that's, you know, what I always told my undergrads is, first, before you have conversations is talk to your principal, tell your principal, I'm going to have these conversations. And we're lucky, and part of our standards in Minnesota have it in our standards that we're going to have these conversations. And so we're lucky in that way. And I would just say to the parents, these are conversations that we're having. This is the way it's going to be, because this is the world that we live in. We are a diverse classroom. And these are the conversations that have to be had in a diverse classroom. Mm-hmm. And because why is it fair that we have students in our classroom of color? We have BIPOC students in our classrooms. So why do we not address issues to make everyone feel comfortable? And I've said before to students, to parents, if your child is that uncomfortable, then you can choose to have them not be a part of these conversations. When reality is those students probably need to hear the conversation, but you can give that parent the out, although you really want that kid in, but you can always give the parent the out. But I always say these conversations are going to happen in the classroom. The districts that I've worked in are typically very supportive of these types of conversations. And I typically say, if you have a problem, then go talk to the principal, because these are the conversations that are going to be happening in the classroom.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for sharing that, Jay. What a great
Yeah.
question.
And it was a great question, because that's something that we often see and we actually had a conversation about this yesterday and I'm doing stamped book club with a group of teachers. And that was something that we were talking about, is the whitewashed history. And one of the social studies teachers was saying that he got called out by some parents because he was teaching not whitewashed history. And he said, the principal just said, this is what we're teaching, all of our perspectives. As I was talking about different perspectives, we're teaching all perspectives of history, because history we have to teach all perspectives now. And so I think that as we are changing, as we are evolving, schools are the places where we have to accept everyone. I told, my opinion is that if you can't be an educator who values all students, then is your place really in the classroom? Because we teach all students.
Yeah, I think, we see that in healthcare too, right? And the differences, and how there's not always this appetite to learn what is different. As a Black woman, there are certain conditions that I am more genetically predisposed to. And so we see this kind of play out in all these spaces. So it's encouraging to hear that there are schools who are setting that as the standard.
Yeah. Yeah, it has to be. And I will say, I'm on the diversity committee at one school and the equity team on the other, and we're working very hard on our equity team to make lots of changes. So, any other questions before I was going to talk about microaggressions?
I don't see any. I see lots of conversation as usual going on in the chat.
I know. I just can't look at the chat while I'm.
It's a lot. Sometimes it's a lot for us, and we're not even talking. So, if this group always knows that you're welcome to put any thoughts, questions in the chat. You're welcome to come off mute too. So, if you have anything, feel free.
Yeah, please. I'm always open to anything. You know me.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about microaggressions.
Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit, as I said earlier, about microaggressions also, because I think it's really important. As I said, with microaggressions, those are comments relating to someone's identity that leave those lasting negative impressions on the person that's getting the message. And they do have a lasting impact, and people might think, oh, that's no big deal if I say that, but that's not true. And sometimes, especially with young kids, they don't understand that what I'm saying isn't a big deal. And so I think that it's really important that we talk with our kids about what are microaggressions and why is it important that you understand what these are. So I actually have a poem that I use to talk with I've talked with my kids about it, and I talk about this with pre-service teachers. I've talked about it with students, and it's Diane Burns is the name of the woman, and the poem is "Sure You Can Ask Me a Personal Question." So I'm sure you gather from the name of the poem, "Sure You Can Ask Me a Personal Question," that where this is going with this poem. And Diane Burns is an Indigenous woman, and the poem is really good. And as the poem goes along, they say, oh, what are you? Are you this? Are you this? Are you this? And then when she finally gets a little clarification within the poem, oh, well, do you know where I can get a Navajo rug? Do you know where I can get, this? Do you know where I can get this? And so I use that poem and just really at first just read the poem. I talk about, well, what do you think, they mean by this? What are these questions? And I kind of just leave it open at the beginning to let students kind of think about, as I say, think about what, does this poem mean? What do they mean by this personal question? And do you think this is hurting this person's feelings by asking these kinds of questions? And so I like to use that poem to have kids really start to debrief about what are these questions and why are they hurtful? And then we talk about what is a microaggression, and we try to come up with a definition based on what we talked about from the poem. And then I give them the real definition of a microaggression. And we talk about, well, why do you think these are hurtful? Why would these be hurtful to people? And then we talk about, so what are some other things, questions that you think might be microaggressions? And then I also have, and then we listen to the poem again, and how has this changed what you think about these personal questions in this poem? And I have some books too that I use for this with kids, because as you know, I have lots of books that we talk about that relate to microaggressions. And one is actually a book full of poems. It's called "Can I Touch Your Hair?" And so it's got some great poems about all kinds of different things. But of course it talks about, like, it's got poems about hair. It's got this Strands one is really good in here about, it ends with, he says, on a random Tuesday on the bus, Dennis asked me, "Can I touch your hair?" And of course, pats it anyway without asking. And then he says, "It feels like a sponge." And then he says, "Oh," and it goes on, he says, "Oh, how about that? Your hair feels like a mop." I say, "My fist's ready," but he turns away. And so, I think it's important when we talk to kids about why is that a microaggression? Why would it be a microaggression to say to someone who is Black that, "Can I touch your hair?" Well, it makes them feel like that makes them different, that white is the norm, and that having hair that is different than that is, not the norm. And then I have this book, "Where Are You From?" So this is another good book where this little girl, who is Latinx, I'm not sure, it doesn't ever say where she is from, but "Where are you from?" Because this is absolutely fabulous, though. I love this book because she keeps getting asked, "Where are you from?" It says, where are you really from?" they insist. And so she asked her grandpa, and he says, but he has all these fabulous things that he says. He says, like, you're from the open land that is free. And so he gives this wonderful, just throughout the whole book, he just keeps saying, you know, you come from the sunshine that lights our path in the world. You come from, so I absolutely love this book. So,
So Dawn, can I ask a question?
yes.
So how do we approach these sort of microaggressions, right? Can I touch your hair? Where are you from? When someone may be asking out of curiosity, right? So we also talk a lot about celebrating differences.
Right.
We talk a lot about, you know, it's good to be different. So, and to educate people about our differences. So what is that? I guess there must be a super fine line between curiosity and a microaggression. Can you touch a little bit upon that?
Yeah, so I actually was then going to get to intent versus impact.
So keep in mind we have 10 minutes left to our hour.
I know. That's why I was trying to talk so fast, because I had so much. Remember, this is why we did 2, because I had so much stuff. Right. So, and that's the problem, right? With microaggressions, and like I said, kids don't quite understand, and I think that's the problem, right? Because kids sometimes don't understand that what I'm saying might hurt. I'm curious about that, which is, remember, the intent versus the impact, right? Because we are different and we celebrate being different. Like, that's right, being colorblind. That's why you can't say, oh, I'm colorblind, because we have to recognize that we're all different, right? And so we recognize that we are different, but the difference is we don't want to make someone feel bad because they're different, right? When we talk about intent versus impact. And so I might have, my intention might not be bad when I say, can I touch your hair? But the impact is what makes it a microaggression, right? Because the impact that it has on the receiver, the person that I asked that question to, might not be what my intent was. And so that's a whole nother thing now, right? If we want to talk then about intent versus impact. And so that's a whole nother lessons or groups of lessons when we talk about, and talking to kids about, like my own kids, when I talk about intent versus impact is, and when we talk about, this gets into, like, even if we want to talk about Indigenous team names or logos, right? It's the same thing. People will argue like, well, but it's an honor. Well, the intent might have been that, yeah, or street names, right? But the impact is not that on Indigenous people. And there's research on this too, I could pull out for you, like, you know, peer-reviewed research. So it's the same thing with microaggressions, is that the intent that I have in asking that question was not that. And most kids, it probably isn't. That's why we have this talk about microaggressions, because I will say a 5-year-old kid saying to someone, can I touch your hair? Their intent is not to be malicious, but the impact that it has says, well, my hair's different. And you're pointing that out. And it's not in a good way, usually, to me. And so, and if we could talk about why that is for a long time, right? And we don't have time today, but, and so that's why then we have to talk about the intent versus the impact, which is usually where I go then after talking about microaggressions. That's why that was last. And so again, that's why I say, like, so what I like to talk about, if you want to talk about intent versus impact with kids, one way to do that again is when you can talk about either with the microaggressions, or say, look at, you could pick an Indigenous team and say, what was the intent of using that? And well, it was to make the team, bring them luck, or to make the team feel like they were strong, or, they were going to do well. But then we talk about, but what was the impact on Indigenous people? How did it make them feel? And so you have conversations about that. And it's not that quick, obviously, but I see we're down to like 6 minutes. So I'm trying to be quick here. And so those conversations have to be had about when we think about either microaggressions or Indigenous team names or anything like that. We have to think about what was our intent versus what is the impact that it had on either that person or groups of people, because that's what's so important, right? And I think I actually got into, I've had arguments with people about, they've said, well, I should be able to ask any question that I want because I want to know. And I'm like, but remember the impact that it had on someone. You have to be empathetic, right? And so it is different, and it is a different fine line with kids, because kids often are different than we as adults, have a lot more higher order thinking than kids. So that's why we have to start having these conversations with kids, right? Because they have to start to understand, oh, wait, intent versus impact. So I think I'll stop there, because I don't know that I have time to get into any more conversations. I think, really the important thing too, because I wanted to talk a little bit about privilege, because that's another thing that my kids are really big on, and they think people should understand that, but I don't really have time. I think it's just important that you listen to kids, you're open with kids, and that you understand that they know a lot more than you think that they do. So I wanted to leave a little time if people had questions, comments.
I think we've agreed that we need part 3. I think that's definitely a given
What,
here.
Tiffany?
Part 3.
Yeah, I know. Well, I try to talk fast.
Go on, Dwayne.
All I would say, Dawn, it was just amazing to hear your perspectives and how you're teaching the children and the resources you're using. And in all my years of counseling, these are great little tricks I want to take on to the next level. That's for sure, and ways of getting the points across. So I'm pretty sure we're all just kind of awestruck by your perspective and your ability to make it so logical.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it.
And as always, the chat was lighting up. So that's where there was so much going on.
Yeah. And I wanted to say, thank you for all the resources. And, the question that Jay asked really resonated with me, because especially as you're teaching children, if we're not taking a really holistic approach, because kids go home. Mm-hmm. And what happens at home has such a huge impact. And we see schools give parents an out. I think we have to stop giving parents an out. I think we have to, and I put it in the chat, it's like, oh, well, it's a different perspective. Well, actually, it's not a really different perspective in history. Like, these are facts of what happened. They just were not taught, or you didn't receive them, but these are still nonetheless the facts. So we've given people an out in even not accepting things because we say it's a different perspective. No, this is what happened. It's not a different perspective. These are things that real human beings experience. Mm-hmm. And we give too many outs. And I think that's why we haven't moved as far along as we need to in some of these things. It's because we allow people to say, oh, I don't want to do that, or, oh, we get into uproar, and then the school changes its curriculum, or what have you. And yeah, no more outs.
I'm totally on board for that. I just totally agree. And it's funny because my kids will call their teachers out. I always laugh because I'm like, well, if you get one of my kids in your class, good luck. Because like my son came home and said, well, they said this or something in class. And he goes, so how do I know that how do I know I'm getting the non-whitewash perspective? And I said, well, how do you know? And he goes, I guess I'm just going to have to look for those primary sources. And I said, that's right. And And my daughter actually said they were reading, I guess, something about Sacagawea, and they said the teacher read something about, well, Sacagawea agreed to help Lewis and Clark, and she goes to her teacher, this must be the whitewash version because Sacagawea was forced by her husband. But I think it's true. Like we see these over and over again, and then nothing happens, or the parent gets the out, and you know, we sometimes feel like we have to, because otherwise then it's like, oh, well, I might lose my job, which is like that history teacher that I was telling you about. He thought he was going to lose his job, but he's like, so what do I do? But parents hold so much power.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like we're sort of in this catch-22, but I'm with you. I'm like, I think it's time that we just say, nope, this is what we're doing. You know, like I said, I'm in this Stamped book club, and have you read Stamped?
I haven't read Stamped yet. I got my son what is it called? The remix version for the teens. And we've been passing it along down the line to other kids. So
right. Well, that's the version we're reading, and
okay,
because we're going to use it for the students. And I'm like, good, because
it's really good. Yeah, I read that one. I didn't read the original.
Yeah, that's the one I don't know that I can read the 500, 600. I don't have time for that.
Right. I read the kids version, which was fantastic.
You know, I kind of want to come back to the point I put in the chat earlier. And that is, unfortunately, what happens is, you know, we tend to grow up looking at our parents as those who know everything. And we don't question what they teach us as children. So I have that lucky situation that I grew up outside the South when I first heard the racist stuff of the South. So it really shocked and appalled me when I heard it, because I was dealing with some stuff, dealing with the 70s racism and such like that, and the 70s busing situation. And then, you know, I go to talk to my father. He grew up in the St. Petersburg area. And I remember one time we were driving through his area, his old neighborhood, which had become black as opposed to lower class white. And just the things I heard him saying, it was just like, God, it was so hateful. And I was like, they had a right, in my head, I'm saying this, they had a right to move up in their world because I know where they came from in the city first, right? And I know where their background was because I had enough education at that point to have a sense. And then, you know, I just remembered the kids that had definitely grown up in that area. They repeated what they heard the adults say, and they did it without question. And I think that was also part of the other thing I noticed because I have moved around so much in my life, I then went back to Texas for college. I hadn't lived in Texas before, but I got to go to Texas for college, and it's a conservative Texas college. So I kind of got to hear their adult versions that they were being racist about. And it was interesting because they loved Black athletes for the accolades and the notoriety they brought to school. But as the saying goes, are you going to let her date your daughter? Let him date your daughter? And the answer was no. I'll hire him for my auto sales business because I'll get a lot of customers who want to come and talk to him during the summer sales season. But no, he's not dating my daughter, kind of thing. So it was sad. They were used, literally used. It was just tragic to watch.
Thank you for sharing that, Dwayne. That was very powerful. Thank you, everyone who joined us and who shared. I know a few people had to drop off for other meetings, but I appreciate you all, and we welcome you to join us every week. And next week will be an unrecorded, so it'll be our Community Connect call. So no guest speaker, no recording. Our very own Suman will be on a little getaway with her family, and so you'll have yours truly here next week. But you know, think about what might be on your minds, or certainly there's enough going on in this world, right, that we can discuss. But I look forward to seeing you all next week. Suman, anything else you want to add as we close?
No, just thank you all for continuing to show up, for continuing to want to learn and hear different perspectives, for creating your calls to action and for just being part of our community. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks,
Yeah,
Dawn.
thanks. Suman and Dawn, can you stay for a little bit?
Yep.
Thank
Bye,
you.
ladies.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
Bye,
everybody.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.